Hello. After a brief summer break, I'm delighted to welcome you back to PCAP's Native Prairie Speaker Series. My name is Caitlin Rose Seiler, and I am the Stewardship Coordinator with Saskatchewan Prairie Conservation Action Plan, or SKPCAP. Today, Michael Mesure from FLAP Canada will be speaking about a bird's eye view, reflecting on bird-building collisions. I've personally been following FLAP's work for several years now, and I'm really excited to have Michael here today. Before we get going, I'd like to start by stating we respectfully acknowledge that we are on the traditional territories of many Indigenous nations and communities, past and present. For millennia, they have worked to protect these landscapes and the life these areas sustain. I'd like to thank these original caretakers and acknowledge the ongoing work and presence of Indigenous peoples in Canada today. And before we begin, I'd like to note that PCAP's Native Prairie Speaker Series is a monthly presentation about anything to do with prairie conservation. Join us on October 30th for a webinar by Environment and Climate Change Canada, as well as the University of Saskatchewan, about prairie pastures, grassland vigor, and grazing effects as observed by satellites from 2000 to 2023. And you can register for upcoming webinars on the PCAP website. Most past webinar presentations can be found on the PCAP YouTube channel, and this webinar will be recorded and uploaded there in the near future. A reminder to our listeners out there, if you have any questions during the presentation, just type it into the question section or the Q&A section of the webinar dashboard at any time. And if you're on a cell phone, you're welcome to send your question by chat to the organizer. Questions will be answered towards the end of the webinar, and you're also welcome to upvote each other's questions or comment as well. I'd like to take a moment to note that financial support for today's webinar is provided by our presenting sponsors, Canadian Forage and Grasslands Association, North American Helium, Nutrien, Saskatchewan Cattlemen's Association, and SaskTel. In-kind support has been provided by FLAP Canada. So I'm really pleased to be able to introduce today's presenter. Michael Mesure is the Executive Director of the Fatal Light Awareness Program, or FLAP Canada, a registered Canadian charity and a founding member of FLAP Canada. He's been with the organization since it began operations in 1993. An author and speaker, Michael regularly delivers presentations on the topic of bird-building collisions, bringing attention to the reflective light issue that impacts over 1 billion birds across North America every year. His work increasingly focuses on solutions to help mitigate and remediate the challenges of bird migrations in built environments, having led the BirdSafe Building Standards and risk assessments to help develop the Canadian Standards Association's bird-friendly design standard as a technical committee member. Michael tirelessly advocates for bird protections at various levels of government, as well as consults with city planners across North America on developing bird-friendly guidelines and standards. In addition to his ongoing bird rescue and recovery patrols, Michael's time is spent partnership building and engaging collaboration to promote bird conservation programs and other renowned initiatives, including the Global Bird Rescue and BirdSafe Campus, and contributing content to ornithological-focused papers such as Collision Course, The Hazards of Lighted Structures and Windows to Migratory Birds, and Window Collisions by Migratory Bird Species, Urban Geographical Patterns and Habitat Associations. And with specialties in fine arts and graphic design, Michael complements his life's work supporting the birds that inspire him with professional development in bird biology from the Cornell Lab of Ornithology and Continuous Learning. So with that, I will pass it over to Michael.
Well, that was an incredible introduction. Let me move over to here and we'll start sharing, if this lets me. And we'll start the presentation. Hopefully you can see that on your end. Yes, let me start from the beginning. Why that jumped ahead like that, I have no idea. Bear with me. I'm going to start over. There. So I'm hoping everyone can hear me. My mute is off. Ready to go. Welcome, everybody, and thank you for this opportunity to present to you. As Kevin was saying, I've been at this for a while, and it's near and dear to my heart. And unfortunately, I would love to be able to say that this issue would be resolved before I might leave this planet, but boy, oh boy, is this a complicated landscape. But one thing for sure, we're making some incredible progress, and I'm going to enlighten you on all these details through this presentation. So before we get into the depths of the issue itself, I'll just give you a little bit of background about our organization, FLAP Canada. As Caitlin said, we were founded back in 1993. A smaller core group of us decided to found the organization. I had been at the bird rescue effort since 1989 here in Toronto, getting up before daybreak in search of birds that were colliding with Toronto's lit towers. And during that time of me starting in 1989 to the organization being founded, people were learning about this crazy guy running around in the downtown core searching for birds before the sun came up. And some people made the effort of going down and looking for me. And hence, as I said, by 1993, there was a core group of us that had built some momentum that we decided to found the organization. Now, we did start out as primarily, if not entirely, a group of caregivers. We were out just trying to rescue birds that we found at the base of the structures, rehabilitate those few that we could release back into the wild, and just kind of keeping data on the different records, different birds that we were encountering. But we very quickly learned that there's a lot more to this than just getting up and rescuing birds. There was need for change. And this is why, as the organization grew, we started to develop different programs within our organization, started to focus on doing some research, creating an educational program. But we really found that as of late, the bulk of our efforts is working with government agencies, industry professionals, developing guidelines, policies, and standards all across the world now. Funny enough, it's not just here in Ontario, not just here in Canada, it's happening everywhere. So, and with that, you can see at the bottom of the screen here examples of some programs we have. BirdSafe is a website dedicated to more of the commercial sector, kind of speaks their language. We're not coming to them as a group of what they would perhaps call tree huggers. We're trying to create an environment where they have confidence and can gain the information they need to help them build buildings with birds in mind. I'll jump ahead to the next screen now and just let you know that since we founded our organization, there's well over 50 flap-like initiatives now across North America, and we're getting a spattering of other flap-like initiatives showing up in Europe. So this, as I said, is gaining some considerable momentum, and all of these different groups are focusing on this, from on-the-street bird rescue efforts to things like I mentioned earlier, what we're doing with policy development and creating ordinances and bylaws and so forth. So it's wonderful to see this all happening at the rate that it's moving. Back to a little bit about the beginning. As I mentioned, we were up before daybreak rescuing birds. We would patrol the base of these structures, and still do to this day, in search of these injured and confused birds. And we would do our best to rescue those birds and also document the dead that we inevitably encountered. With that, we go around the downtown core and outlying areas, and this is what the back of our car can look like sometimes. Every bird we find, they're stored in individual paper bags. Excuse me, unwaxed paper bags. Very important to mention that, because some paper bags are waxed, and the beauty of an unwaxed paper bag is you can scrunch that bag up and the bird will not suffocate inside that bag. And the nice thing about that sort of shell is it reduces their stress level. They don't see other birds, they don't see us, we're considered a threat to them. And we put them aside in a quiet location in our vehicles until we're able to release them back in the wild if we're fortunate enough to do so. The other thing about a paper bag is the birds do soil the bags. And with that, every bird that's released, those paper bags are recycled. So they go to a good use in the recycling area as well. We look for different types of injuries. They can range from feather damage, there's occasional broken bones, there's even beak damage. You can see the example here of the northern flicker, where the tip of its beak has broken off from the impact of the window. Now, that is an example of a far less common injury. The more common injury, and sadly the most common forms of death, are both head trauma and can also be ruptures to organs, primarily the liver, and they bleed internally. So it isn't a broken neck like most of us our eyes deceive us. We seem to believe that the broken neck is the cause of bird death, but birds have a very rigid short spinal column portion of their neck, and very rarely does it sustain that kind of trauma. And as you saw from the paper bags, we drive to a release site out of the built environment and release whatever birds we can that are ready to go, release them back into the wild in some natural habitat away from the built environment. Our area here in Toronto is funny enough, not far bigger than that. It's well over 4,400 square kilometers. We have some 50 volunteers that go out monitoring different pockets of these different regions. We are touching the tip of the iceberg, and yet we're still picking up thousands of birds. That being said, we also have flap efforts happening in other parts of the country. I'll get into that in a little while, but I just thought I'd show you that geographical map in terms of where we focus our efforts here in Toronto. The good news is that roughly 30% of the birds we pick up are alive, and we hope, after providing them with the care they require, depending on their injuries, they're released back into the wild, hoping that they will survive. Now, a little bit of a downer here. We're recently learning that studies are now indicating that even a live bird that looks healthy, ready to go, and is released back in the wild, they very rarely survive the initial injury, because these types of injuries are hidden. A brain injury, an organ injury is internal, and we just cannot see the rate to which those injuries are advancing themselves. So sadly, even though we like to think every one of our birds we release back in the wild survive, statistically, it's not looking quite that way. Of the dead birds we pick up, we developed a partnership with the Royal Ontario Museum. Every bird that we do pick up, we provide, we put in a unique tag number around each of those birds. That number is included in the data entry we keep on those birds. And when they arrive at the museum, they can go into those into our records with those tag numbers and know exactly where, when that bird was found. We also, once we accumulate all the birds over a given migration season, the following year, early spring, we hold a public awareness campaign event where we invite people into the ROM and we lay out all our birds for them to see these birds. And it is one of the most powerful ways of educating the public. When they walk through those spaces, they are just, in some cases, people don't leave the room for the day. They will stay there just in awe of what they're looking at, in part because they're looking at birds that they didn't even realize existed in the country. And just to see them in that way laid out, it's quite an experience for people. And we will, unfortunately, continue to do this until hopefully we no longer have to. So the issue itself, very important to point out, there are two key differences as to why a bird will collide with a building. One is the bright light that can escape from these structures at night or being floodlit upon them. A city like Toronto tends to have the bulk of these types of concerns. We find that outside of large built environments, especially those that are away from large bodies of water, the nighttime issue can be non-existent unless they encounter certain weather conditions where there's inclement precipitation or fog that appears on a heavy night of migration. Statistically, the daytime issue is by far the more deadly concern. And this is a result of daylight reflecting off of glazed surfaces. And funny enough, when flaps started, our entire efforts actually for the first couple of years was just getting downtown before daybreak. But we found that once we stuck around a little bit after daybreak, there was this whole other wave of collisions that would take place. And not only another wave, they would triple, sometimes quadruple the number of birds that we found before daybreak. And with that, it clearly emphasized the need to educate on the daytime collision area as well. And this is where everybody at some point in time has experienced this. And this is why this issue is so familiar to people, is we all either work in or live in a structure that has a window. And I can pretty much guarantee you, every single one of those structures has had a bird collide with those structures at some point in time. Sometimes on an annual basis, sometimes on a monthly basis, sometimes on a daily basis, sometimes on an hourly basis. So it's an issue we cannot ignore. And it has become one of the leading causes of bird death across the country. It's the second leading cause of death, actually, second only to cats. Cats are the leading cause, the number one cause of bird death. Examples historically, when you go and look at the nighttime issue, some of the first human-built structures that emit bright light, and to this day, some still exist in this way, were structures like the lighthouse, where there's records of thousands upon thousands of birds circling in those lights and colliding outright with those structures or just dropping from exhaustion at the base of those structures. When you look at the daytime issue and glass, Glass itself has gone through quite an evolution of perfecting itself. Glass first appeared on the landscape in the year 2000, and it really didn't perfect itself till the mid 1800s, where they learned how to do a refinery process that gave it that high polished look, and it just keeps getting more and more refined through the years. And hence today, it's, as they say, you can look at a window and it's like you're looking in a mirror. Now, back in time, one of the first individuals to start to look at this bird building collision concern was a gentleman by the name of Barry Kent Mackay. He is an artist and a wildlife activist. He's here in Ontario, and he learned of this issue by happening to encounter bird collisions, not at a high rise, but it was at a communication tower in Barrie. And he initially started to make that his primary location for monitoring. But very quickly back to Barrie himself, as you can tell, he's also a world-renowned artist. So he paints birds and paints them beautifully. He's illustrated numerous books, field guides, you name it, and continues to this day to craft that art. The first structure that he started to monitor that was a high-rise was, again, here in Toronto, the first of a series of TD towers, the Toronto Dominion Centre. And back in his time, when he would arrive before daybreak, he would arrive and see wheelbarrows being filled with birds. They would shovel these birds up and cart them away in these wheelbarrows before people would come into work. And now Financial District is just totally engulfed these towers, where it appears to be a lesser concern because fewer birds are being found at structures like this, but it's simply because there's just so many structures, they're being knocked out before they can even get to some of these historic structures like that at the TD Centre. Numbers were shared by Caitlin earlier. The numbers currently are for North America are over 1 billion birds. Now, there is a study that was done by Environment Canada that estimates some 25 million birds are dying here in Canada. For what it's worth, I feel this is a significantly underestimated study. Numbers that we encounter here in Canada, I'll get to that in a moment as well, but will demonstrate the gravity of this problem has got to exceed 25 million birds for Canada. But the other disturbing aspect of this statistic is the study, when it originally came out a number of years ago, has been revisited, and now they're estimating that over 3 billion birds a year are dying as a result of collisions with windows across North America. Toronto, as I mentioned, as an example, it's estimated that for the city of Toronto alone, over 1 million birds are dying each year. And, you know, as I mentioned, so our volunteers are touching the tip of the iceberg's structures. So it's a big concern, needs to be dealt with seriously, and we are starting to see some progress. I'm going to get into that in a moment, but a little bit about why this is such a significant concern here in Toronto is when you look at migratory corridors, there are 4 major corridors that they overlap each other, that stretch from north to south across North America. It's the Pacific, Central, Mississippi, and Atlantic corridors. Well, Toronto happens to sit through 2 of the busiest overlapping corridors. And with that, Toronto also has an abundance of green space, offering a wonderful opportunity for temporary housing areas during their migration seasons. But it also sits up against a large body of water. Statistically speaking, higher collisions do tend to occur both by night and by day in large urban centers that sit up against these large bodies of water. Now, the other important thing to point out here is, in the mind's eye, when you say bird collisions with buildings, well, you are automatic to assume that the bulk of these collisions are occurring at the tallest of structures. The taller the structure, the more deadly that structure can be. Well, guess what? Statistically, a structure only needs to be 1 story high to kill a dramatic number of birds. In fact, of all the structures that we monitor here in Toronto, some of the most lethal facades are only 2-3 stories high. And that's simply because these birds, they're not, the birds that are most vulnerable to collisions, they're not during the day moving around at the higher altitudes of a given structure. they're in the tree canopies. They're moving through those tree canopies. They're gobbling up insects, eating seeds, eating fruit to replenish their depleted energy reserves from the night migration the night before. And they all kind of move at different heights within that tree canopy, depending on the family of birds that they're in. So don't assume, please, that you have to put your primary focus on the taller of the structures, because that is just not the case, okay? The type of species we encounter, there's another example of one of our bird layouts there in the background. When we look at our data, some of the more common species that we pick up that are vulnerable to both nighttime and daytime collisions are the white-throated sparrow, the ovenbird, and the ruby-throated hummingbird. Now, the ruby-throated hummingbird is more of a diurnal species, diurnal migrant, and we do tend by far to find more during the daytime. But these are kind of within that top 10 species that we would encounter in a given year. There's also these at-risk species, and examples of the type of at-risk species we encounter are the Canada warbler, the eastern whippoorwill, and the wood thrush. Now, to date, I think we've now encountered 28 at-risk species. In total, the number of species are 178, and we're now well over 100,000 records, which are stored in our global bird collision mapper. Another slide on that to come. Examples of types of structures are homes. Whenever I do presentations in person, I'll ask for a show of hands. How many of you have ever had a bird collide with your window at your home, cottage? And the vast majority of people's hands go up. But again, it's not limited to our homes and cottages. It's our condos and apartments. It can be bus shelters. It can be our vehicles. It can be sound barriers and transparent railing systems. It can also obviously be the workplace within large urban centers with a large abundance of modern architecture. Transparent railing systems, as I mentioned, have become a really big concern. And with that, it's no wonder these strikes are occurring. This is an example of one of the structures we monitor. And no wonder birds are colliding with a structure like this. It's what's real and what's not. Where is the tree? And the thing about a collision with a window during the day, this is not limited to birds. This happens to us. I'm sure some of you yourself have walked into either a window or a screen door at your patio. Without some kind of visual reference on that window, the chances of a collision is almost 100%. If you go into any mall, any high rise, any building where people frequently are moving in and out, you'll notice that at our eye level, there's always something there. It could be a series of logos. It could be a line of stretch from one side of the window to another. That's in place so that we, as humans, don't walk right into those panels of glass. We have to extend the same courtesy to the birds. It's a little more challenging, but I have tips on how that can be done, and we'll get into that in a moment. It's also the transparent qualities of glass, where birds are seeing directly through one side of a transparent wall to another, or they're seeing vegetation on the inside of a given building. It could be the lobby in a high rise. Again, they're not seeing the glass, they're seeing what's behind that glass. And we have to extend the same courtesy again there, where there's markers on the windows, not only for people, but for birds as well. Just to give an example of how deadly a single transparent sheet of glass, in this case, what you're looking at is plexiglass, can kill a bird. And you'll notice that little red circle there. That was a Nashville warbler sitting on the table. It was alive, and it had flown directly into this transparent wall, which was in place during COVID. That was there when people were forced to sit behind sheets of glass, and they kept them up, and birds were colliding with it. So it doesn't have to be a high rise. It doesn't have to be a massive window to kill a bird or to injure a bird. Now, very important, going to dispel some myths here. And one of these myths, one that I like to call snake oil, and is still to date one of the most well-known and popular techniques, is the bird of prey decal. Now, when this technique arrived in the landscape, the designer thought that these birds would see this shape, perceive it as a threat, and would avoid the glass that it was adhered to. Well, the birds have shown us time and time again that they're simply not that stupid. They do see this shape, but they don't perceive it as a threat. It's just a shape, and they will not collide in the immediate area where that deck was adhered, but they will collide anywhere else no deck was apparent to their eye. And sadly, when people do this particular technique, they will buy that one decal, they'll smack it up in the outside corner, upper corner of their window, and they think, voila, magic, problem solved. Please do not purchase this product. It doesn't save birds' lives. I'm going to, as I mentioned, give you some tips on how one can achieve this, how they can save birds' lives. And just to give an example of a building that did apply decals. Now, you're looking at a structure that I monitor in the city of Margaret, which is an outlying municipality outside of Toronto that has a significant bird collision problem. Now, as you can see, it is a 2 to 3 story structure. And yet we pick up bird after bird after bird at this structure. And I did, just a little while ago, they changed management. I met the new manager. They came out of the building wondering, who are you and what are you doing on our property? And I introduced them to the problem. And she said, oh yeah, we get birds here all the time. I said, you need to mitigate this concern, but whatever you do, don't buy decals. Went there a week later. What's on the windows? Decals in a little tiny corner of the building. And beneath that, I picked up 18 dead birds. So again, just to emphasize the point, say goodbye to the bird of prey deck, please. Now, this is how you can make a window treatment safe for birds, but you have to know a little bit about how it works before you can achieve it. In this particular case, and some of you may have seen this image already, you have to create markers on these windows in such a way that the bird feels they can can't slip through that space of the markers that you have on that window. So that means the entire surface of that window has to be covered with a marker, and these markers can't be spaced any greater than 5 centimeters apart vertically and 5 centimeters horizontally. These markers can be anything you want them to be, and I'll give you examples of what those look like in a minute. Now, the problem is, much like the bird of prey decal, people are looking for the magic pill. They're looking for something magically to resolve their problem so that glass can continue to look the way it does. Well, this is being based on, this particular technique I'm showing you now is based on ultraviolet light. Birds see a wavelength of ultraviolet that the human eye cannot detect. And the idea is that we place markers on windows that have these transparent markers on them that have UV coatings that reflect this wavelength of ultraviolet lights that we do not see. There are some products out there now that have adopted this. They are selling this product. They are making lots and lots of money off of it. Unfortunately, there are certain aspects of ultraviolet light, certain formula you have to follow in order for it to work, have a chance at working effectively. And even then, it won't work. Now, just to give an example of how ultraviolet works for birds, this is the bird on the right-hand side is how we as humans see that bird. The bird on the left is how birds perceive each other. And you can see how the ultraviolet light in the bird's eye works. Now, this is the formula. We do not need to go into detail about how this formula works, because even if you adopt this formula, there has to be direct sunlight to have contact with that UV treatment in order for it to bounce back in the way that it needs to into the bird's eye so that they can see that as a marker on the window. Which means if you're treating the north side of a building that has a high volume of bird collisions and the sunlight never touches those windows, an ultraviolet marker will have little chance of working effectively. So please don't jump on this yet until they perfect it, they prove that it actually works the way they hope it's working. Okay? Now, here's what we can do. In order for a marker to work effectively, and I'm going to give you an example here of a dotted pattern. This has become the most popular pattern out there for treating windows to prevent bird strikes. If you treat that window with a dark marker, and that dark marker is reflecting a darker environment, it's very difficult to see. So you need to go to a light marker. And in this case, going to a white works beautifully. You can see how much more apparent it is to the eye. But let's say that is reflecting open space, or it could be out into a parking lot, whatever it might be. A white marker almost disappears. So you need to go to a dark marker. The way to achieve both is duotone. Rotate between a light and a dark marker so that regardless of what the abundance of daylight is, it has a chance of working under varying daylight conditions. Now, examples of patterns that you can adopt, it's infinite. I just took an arrowhead pattern, and I created examples of different patterns that you can create with just an arrowhead pattern that meets the criteria of spacing. And I'll just kind of rotate them as I go through. Some are denser than others, but the arrowhead has just a simple shape to play with. You can come up with some very interesting, aesthetically appealing patterns, some busier than others, that still allows you to see through that glass, doesn't obscure our ability to see through that glass. The other important aspect of treating a window is, and this is a really big mistake that's made, people approach treating their windows to save birds' lives by applying them to the inside of a window, or at the manufacturing stage of a window, they treat it on the second surface of the glass, which is, in the case of a thermal pane, the second surface is the inside surface of the first layer of glass that is on the outside of a window. If you do not treat the first surface of glass, you're almost defeating the purpose of treating that window in the first place to save birds' lives. An example I can give you is this. You can see this, you're standing outside, you can see into this living space in this particular example. At a certain time of day, you can see directly into that space, but as that daylight shifts, that transparent quality of glass, the first surface becomes a mirror, and it automatically hides whatever is behind it. So in order to assure that whatever markers you put on windows works properly, it has to go on the outside surface, or there's no point in even treating your windows. Now, how did all this knowledge come to be? Well, it came from a number of individuals, but what I choose to call the godfather of bird building collisions is this gentleman here, Dr. Daniel Clem. He's been doing research on bird building collisions out of Muhlenberg College in Pennsylvania for the past 50 years. And he has perfected the methods. He has come up with all kinds of so much valuable, interesting facts about bird building collisions. And he actually just released a book called Solid Air. If you haven't read it already, it's worth a read, full of knowledge. But what he did, and when he started to do field studies on different ways to treat windows, he started with a flight tunnel. And it's a long tunnel where they will misnet birds. They'll bring the birds to those tunnels, and they'll release them one by one in these little openings on one end. And on the far end of this dark tunnel are two sheets of glass. One is treated, the other is not. And they count the number of times that bird will fly either right or left, and it gives a threat level as to how effective that marker is. Dr. Daniel Clem, as I mentioned, created this particular design. He abandoned it because he found there was a number of flaws. It just wasn't a fair representation of the real world. And I agree. To me, these flight tunnels is kind of like, you picture yourself standing on the edge of a cliff, and someone is about to push you off that cliff. And you have to choose if you're going to fall on the rocks or fall on the sand. These birds are kind of in a panic state. They're not going about their day-to-day life, meandering down this tunnel like as if they're foraging for food. So it's skewed, and also the daylight can affect how they perceive those markers on the window. So what Dr. Daniel Clem did, and by no means is this even perfect, but it's a greater representation of the real world. He sets up these feeding stations, and not a short distance away from these feeding stations in a natural environment, he has panels of glass, and each glass has different markers on it. Some do have markers, some don't. And they count the number of times a bird will collide with those panels of glass. Some will leave smudge marks on the windows. Some will fall into these baskets at the base of these panels. But this has provided some greater knowledge on what does represent a better or lesser effective bird collision deterrent. Examples of different techniques. By far, one of the most common current approaches for treating windows are window films for both new and existing buildings. They cut these films into different patterns. Some are artistic, like the one you're seeing here, beautiful patterns on windows that tell a story, to others just being a simple dotted pattern. But there's also fritting. There's ceramic frits, where they bake the patterns right into the glass. This example is at the library at the University of British Columbia, where there are all the famous quotes from books from each professor's favorite books. Very creative way of putting a marker on a window to the theme of a building. That was also told a story, and it was just a perfect example of a creative way of applying a marker to a window. But there's also other techniques. There's digital printing on glass. There's etching on glass. They have external sunscreens. They have grill work. You can even silk screen on windows. It goes on and on. Just the key is it has to go on the outside surface. Now, these are more commercial, as it says, but examples of homes, you can have a little bit more flexibility at home. And it's a far more cost-effective approach from buying things like shelving paper, and again, window film like do-it-yourself markers from Feather Friendly. You can whitewash glass. You can draw on glass with oil-based markers. You can buy exterior sunshades, and again, grill work. There's even cables from a company called Copian BirdSafe, or you can create your own cables. As long as those spaces don't exceed that 5-centimeter gap, they're going to work effectively for you, okay? Now, very important as well, keep your bird feeders in the best locations. People love to enjoy birds, and bird feeding is one of the most popular sort of methods for observing birds in nature. But the problem is people tend to place their bird feeders at the worst possible distance. So you're attracting birds to your backyard, you're placing them in a hot zone for a greater potential for harm to that bird so that you can observe them from inside your home. And again, statistically, it's shown that within 5 meters and beyond is the worst location. Best location is less than 1 meter, ideally right up against your window. And this is an example of a window feeder. You can stick right onto the glass. That it doesn't mean a bird won't collide with that window, but it does mean that the bird tends to not pick up enough momentum to harm themselves when they do collide. So that doesn't mean by moving your feeders up against your window, you don't treat your windows. Please, please do still treat your windows if you can. And keep your cat indoors. I just thought I'd tuck that little message in there as well. A history of progress. Back in 2005, FLAP submitted a notice of motion to the City of Toronto in the hopes that they might consider focusing on the bird building collision here in Toronto. And the notice of motion was passed almost unanimously. And with that, Toronto was the first to introduce the first of its kind bird-friendly development guidelines, which has now been used as a template for other cities across North America. And more municipalities are jumping on board, introducing either guidelines for best practices or standards and policies in their community. I'm not sure which one this is, or examples of how one approaches a building. I mentioned earlier about up to that 16-meter level is the hot zone, but it's not limited to that, because in some cases, especially with some modern architecture, they have rooftop gardens. They have terraces that are on the 12th floor. Those areas have to be treated as if you're at ground level, and those windows need to be treated accordingly as well. Grill work at the base of buildings are an important thing to be considered. When you have grill work at the base of a structure, the porosity or the gaps between that grill work, if a bird collides and falls to the ground, they'll slip through those grates, and then they get trapped in those ventilation grates when they gain their consciousness. So those grates need to be covered, or the porosity, the spacing needs to be reduced so that birds can't slip through. And just treating the windows in a variety of ways, much like I mentioned earlier, all very important aspects of making a building safe for birds, whether it's a new build or an existing building. And these are examples of regions across Ontario that have introduced some form of mandatory requirements. There's some 20 here in Ontario, 8 are in the works. And then there's cities across the country that are now introducing mandatory requirements, including in places like Winnipeg and Edmonton and Montreal. How did so much progress suddenly start to take place? Well, it took years for FLAP to finally earn the respect and to really gain the ear of some key audiences, most importantly, the government. And this really all started back in 2009 when we tested the first of its kind commercial grade window pattern. And this was a transparent window film that had rows of black lines made up of a series of black dots spaced 5 centimeters apart from each other on a window that had high collisions. It was a City of Markham building. And shortly after the windows being treated, the collisions almost virtually stopped. And so we knew we had something here. The problem was wide-scale production and longevity. We learned that a transparent window film with a marker printed on it, very shortly thereafter, even though it's a window film designed for exterior applications, it turns milky. And not long, it looks like you're looking through a frosted window, impossible to look through. So what we did, indirectly, through a first of its kind precedent-setting lawsuit, we tested another marker. This is the first of its kind lawsuit between Menkes Developments and Ontario Nature, where Menkes was brought to court over extensive bird death occurring at their facility. This court case took place in 2010. We tried to get them to work with us in the past. They wouldn't. But lo and behold, midway through the trial, they wanted to work with us. And we introduced the first of its kind commercial grade product. This is not FLAP's product. We worked in partnership with a company called the Convenience Group. And we treated the entire building up to the 60-meter level, actually 2 buildings up to the 60-meter level with these dots. The reason they did not want to explore or humor the idea of treating their window with a marker was aesthetics and cost. Well, it does cost a little bit, but it does not break their bank. Aesthetically, what they did to prepare for the challenge of aesthetics is they put a damage control program in place, waiting to deal with all the complaints we're going to get from their tenants. Well, up go the markers. They wait. Not a single complaint. They then went and did a random interview of their tenants. What do you think of these markers on our windows? And their response was, what markers? They didn't even notice them. So all these years of fighting, no way we're going to make our building look ugly. And lo and behold, no one even noticed they went up in the first place. There was a second trial, Cadillac Fairview versus Podolsky. Podolsky was an eco-justice lawyer. Cadillac Fairview was brought to court over extensive bird death happening at one of their facilities. This was back in 2013. They too would not put markers up. Midway through the trial, lo and behold, up go the markers. This facility is now almost entirely treated with markers. The collisions have dropped again dramatically. Now, the important thing to point out about any marker, next to removing a window entirely, as long as there is still some transparent and reflective qualities, birds will continue to collide. But the reduction of collisions for a marker like this is no less than 80%. It's upwards of 90% collision reduction as a result of applying these markers. Law came into effect as a result of the second trial. Evidence was shared during the trial. They had a series of experts. FLAP had all the data. We were kind of like a key witness for both of these trials. Experts sat on the stand that were able to demonstrate that once daylight reflects from a window, it's reflected in the form of radiation. Now, under the Environmental Protection Act, there is a section dedicated to contaminants. And under those, anyone who emits a contaminant that harms or kills a migratory bird that results in the harm or death to that bird are in violation of that law. Well, it just so happens that radiation is in that list of contaminants. So this is how law came into effect, first with the province of Ontario, and now federally. So it's now law for Canada under the Species at Risk Act, and just recently in 2022 under the Migratory Bird Convention Act. So that means anyone that has a bird collision at a window could be held liable under this law. However, This law is really designed for those buildings that are killing extensive number of birds, have the means to be able to mitigate that threat, and aren't doing anything to deal with it. But there's more to this. And I started out municipally as an example. There's also opportunity for municipalities to enforce the protection of birds under the bird collision concern. Most municipalities have something called public nuisance bylaws. And these public nuisance bylaws don't allow for things like feeding wildlife. Now, one of the biggest challenges we have in rescuing birds at buildings is getting to these birds, whether they're dead and alive, before they're scavenged by wildlife. So a building has a bird strike, they fall to the ground, that bird can sit there for minutes, be scavenged, they can sit there for days. But the fact is they're attracting to their building and feeding wildlife as a result of birds colliding with their windows. And one can argue, unless they fix the problem, they can be charged under these bylaws. So keep your eye on that in your regions to see if you can get municipalities involved, because municipalities cannot enforce provincial or federal law. Now, as mentioned earlier, FLAP sat as a stakeholder on the Canadian Standards Association's working group to develop a standard that will hopefully one day be adopted by the building code. But currently, it's a voluntary standard, and cities from across the country are using this standard to develop their own policies, their own guidelines in their community. We at FLAP want this to become part of the national building code. And we've been at this now for 3 years, trying to get them to adopt it. They're finding all kinds of excuses not to, but they're finding it harder and harder to come up with excuses. The fact is the building code was designed for human safety. It was not designed for wildlife conservation. However, under the building code, they do state the protection of the natural environment. So this can clearly be adopted. We just need as many people to speak up here and support this. So if you can consider doing that in your end by advocating for this in some shape or form, either going through our website or just doing some kind of campaign locally to gain the ear of the National Building Code. This is so important to take place. Okay. Some apps I would love for you to consider having on hand in your day-to-day life. One is our Global Bird Collision Mapper. This is a GIS database where you can enter a bird building collision record from anywhere around the world. You can either do it online through the website, birdmapper.org, or you can download the app right onto your cell phone. And you can enter live right there, standing in front of that bird. You take a photograph of that bird, it locates you on GPS technology, asks you a series of questions, and submit. And you can see, just as an example, all the different entries now appearing on the mapper just through the Great Lakes region. There's now well over 100,000 records, and it's just growing day by day all across the globe. If you get a chance to visit the site, please do, and please do download this app. It's a very useful tool. Community science, or citizen science, has become one of the most valuable resources for government and research bodies. And this data is proving to be used for all kinds of research to try and mitigate this concern. We also have a do-it-yourself risk assessment app. It asks you a series of, I think, 23 questions, yes or no, and it'll spit out a risk level at the end of that assessment. And we recommend that any window that you assess, whether it's a window at your home or your workplace, anything that sits within the high risk to lethal range, it needs to be not only treated, it needs to be treated immediately, because it's demonstrating a substantial risk to birds. And then there's another new survey app called the Bird Friendly Building Survey. And what it does is it gives an individual the opportunity to do one of three things. It will help identify a problematic building based on its characteristics, and perhaps even some collision data. It will also identify buildings that have been partially retrofitted with birds in mind, or birds that have been retrofitted or entirely built with birds in mind. And they're identified by a green, amber, or red marker that lands on the map as well. Very valuable information, because what we're finding is there's some incredible new designs out there that have been in part designed with birds in mind that you would never even think were being designed for birds. They're just a whole new aesthetic appeal to architecture. So very valuable information. Please do consider downloading this app as well. All you have to do again is go to the birdmapper.org website. Gives you all the steps on how to do that. Now, September, oh, sorry, let me just make sure I have this right. Oh no, this is in your area, that's right. So examples of entries in your area. Living Sky Wildlife Rehabilitation out of Saskatoon have been entering all records they have, and you can see how chaotic the landscape looks there in Saskatoon. And more recently, Nature Regina is starting to record bird collisions in their city as well. We need more and more people using this. We need this resource being used to its fullest. So please do continue to, if you're doing so, or just signing on and having that app handy. Now, we have our Global Bird Rescue coming up. Global Bird Rescue is, again, it's a global event where we try to get people across the globe to go out into their community. This year, it's September 23rd to the 29th for 7 days to record birds that they find during that 7-day period. Now, you can do this as an individual, or you can create a team. The website gives you all the steps on how to create a team if that's what you're interested in doing. But the key here is it's not only about rescuing birds during that 7-day period and documenting them into the Global Bird Collision Mapper. It's also raising awareness. It gives all kinds of social media posts that you can circulate through your own efforts, through your own organization, to try and raise the awareness of this bird building collision concern. Okay. These are examples of cities from across the globe that participate in our event. We want to get more and more people, either as individuals or as teams, participating. So please do consider participating during this year's Global Bird Rescue event. I need to take a drink here, just 1 second. There we go. Now, in closing, just as a reminder, why this is so important to protect birds, it probably is a given based on the audience I'm presenting to today, but we cannot forget the value of what birds do for us. Primary contributions are they control our insect populations, they pollinate our plants, they distribute seeds, and they provide food for other forms of wildlife. But it's not limited to that. It's also the bird watching industry. Bird watching has become a multi-million-dollar industry across North America. And you do not have to be an avid bird watcher to be considered a bird watcher. If you're feeding birds in your backyard, you are part of that world. And this contributes now because of emerging technologies and bird collision deterrent products. It's injecting hundreds of thousands, if not millions of dollars into our economy. So we cannot ignore these facts. And it's so important that we do our part to protect these birds as best we can. And, you know, when you really think about it, what's being asked of people here is really not a big deal. It's easy to do. This is not like trying to bring a dead lake back to life or a forest that's been destroyed, where it takes years and years to take effect. You treat your windows today, the problem stops almost immediately. How often can you say that? And if we all do this collectively, it's unbelievable the number of birds' lives that can be spared. So please, please, please do consider retrofitting your windows at your home, your cottage, or your workplace, and you'll be playing a key role in protecting birds' lives. And with that, that's the end of my presentation. So I'm going to just turn off the share screen, and if there are any questions to ask here, I'm here to do my best to answer them.
Absolutely. There's already a lot of questions. But first of all, thank you so much for the really, really informative presentation and the amazing work that Flap is doing. It's pretty incredible.
Thank you.
So we have a ton of questions.
Oh boy.
We'll try to go through them kind of rapid fire, I guess. And if people have other questions there, feel free to do that. And I know some of the questions were kind of answered already as you've been going. So we'll just sort of start with the most popular ones and go from there. So are there like since reflected light is harming birds and could be considered an offense under SARA and Environmental Protection Act, have there been any actions or fines, like enforcement actions or fines?
Uh, right. I'm glad that's being asked. Okay. Here's one of the challenges. When this law came out, the Ministry of Environment, Conservation, and Parks were looking for a way to get rid of it. And the reason being, we're all breaking the law in some shape or form. How can they enforce a law that everybody's breaking? And this is why we really need to find other methods to create this change without relying on legal precedents. However, we have had some success at some of our problematic buildings that we monitor through filing complaints to the ministry. And they do, depending on the gravity of the problem, they do send an inspector out and give these people ultimatums. You need to retrofit your building. If you don't, you will be held accountable under the law. So do consider this as a resource. In fact, federally, the federal government is looking to ramp this up more. They're beginning to recognize the desperate situation that we're in for bird building collisions. And I now submitted 50 complaints to the federal government at buildings just here in the Toronto region that are clearly in violation of the law and aren't doing anything. This does not mean that the doors are going to come crashing down and they're going to be doing an investigation tomorrow. In fact, they still have to come to investigate. But slowly but surely, I think that as these complaints are responded to and we see buildings being forced to comply, this will resonate across the real estate investment world. And they'll begin to recognize that this is an issue they cannot avoid anymore. So the more complaints, the better. Okay.
That's good to know. There's a few people wondering if you could clarify, did you say that Edmonton has adopted bird-friendly building guidelines?
It's my understanding that they have guidelines in place. Yes. I don't think they have anything for mandatory. I could be wrong. But this is the thing about this. This is changing almost daily. We're seeing more and more regions introducing guidelines and in some cases mandatory requirements for new builds in their community. So what I would suggest is just type in, bird friendly Edmonton. You'll probably get Nature Canada's bird friendly city program pop up. But if you dig deeper and look for things like guidelines and standards, you'll soon learn if it's a guideline based effort or if they're also doing requirements for new builds as well.
Okay. Perfect. And someone is wondering if a screen door works as a deterrent.
Good question. So screens do help. They kind of like a dirty window, actually. In fact, one of the techniques they recommend for homeowners is don't clean your windows. But they won't work as effectively as something like a marker that's been designed specifically to reduce bird strikes. Screens were thought also to act as a trampoline, depending on how far that screen sits away from a window. But in many cases, the screens do not sit far enough away. The bird can still have impact with that panel of glass that sits behind it. So please don't leave it at a screen as a sole means to reduce bird strikes. Do consider going the distance and treating your windows as well.
Okay. And this is something that you and I were talking about beforehand, but another attendee is wondering if you have any data about wind farms on bird populations.
Wind farms. So yeah, wind farms became really popular back in, I guess, the late 1990s, early 2000. And it's kind of lost a little bit of momentum now. No doubt about it, depending on the geographical location, wind turbines can be a big problem. The initial designs that appeared on the landscape were more problematic than the ones we see now. But they still do, again, based on geographical location, can cause some significant problems. We don't collect data on that. And there, as you dig around on the internet, you'll find lots of examples of locations that have this problem. And in some areas, they have mechanisms in place where they'll turn those turbines off on nights of heavy migration. But even those tend to be few and far apart. But look, I'm going to be frank here. It's an issue. Yes, it needs to be dealt with. But when you look at the bird building collision concern, collisions with windows puts the wind turbine issue to shame. Window collisions is a massive problem. And if I can ask that, if there's only so much time in one's day to dedicate to an effort, I can promise you, you're going to save a hell of a lot more birds if you focus on the bird building collision issue. Okay.
Wow, that's really interesting. Very powerful. And another attendee is wondering, why can't birds recognize reflections while humans can?
Well, humans can't, unless there's something like a marker on the window to alert them. Go onto YouTube, type in people walking into windows. You can spend all day watching videos, one after another. We are just as easily deceived by this. The thing is, you know, we're used, if we take an example of our home, we know where our windows are. We're used to them. We know where they exist. The birds that we encounter that are more vulnerable to collisions, they're just passing through the region. And if they happen to be passing through your backyard, they're not familiar with that environment. And the first thing they're going to do is look for food and shelter. And if they see that reflected in any given window, they're going to go to it. So, yeah, it's an issue that you as a homeowner can address. I think I answered the question, right? Did I answer the question?
Yeah, you did.
Okay, good. I got ahead of myself.
We're running out of time here, but we have a few comments that I just wanted to kind of pass on. Jeffrey has said that Nature Regina's BirdSafe initiative has found 273 birds from 53 rescues, including 47 species since the fall of 2020. And that was a survey done for just 1 week in the spring and 1 week in the fall for only an hour in the mornings. And it sounds like that was part of FLAP's Global Bird Rescue event that kind of launched their program there. And then a listener named Sarah said that Regina is having a municipal election this fall, and this is a good time to consider raising the issue with city council candidates there as well. So thank you, Sarah, for bringing that up. And then another attendee, Mercy, who's been a past speaker at our webinars before, said this is a shameless plug, but she's doing some monitoring in Saskatoon with the push in particular to document birds that hit the city of Saskatoon buildings. The city's proposed, but unfortunately has failed to fund window retrofits for the city buildings. So she's hoping that her data will actually spur them to kind of fund their own initiative. And she said anyone who's interested can follow her at migration_monitoring_YXE on Instagram. So thanks, Mercy, for sharing that too. And so I know we don't have a lot of time left here at all, but Penny has said this was an excellent resource of information for birders like me. Thank you for the very informative presentation, and she'll be definitely passing this information on. And happy bird migration. And she'll be doing September 23rd to 28th. She'll be protecting her windows. So I just thought I'd forward those comments on. So thank you so much, Michael, for the amazing presentation. We really, really appreciate you taking the time to share all this information with us.
Yeah, my pleasure. Enjoyed it. Thank you.
Awesome. And to all of our attendees, thank you so much for catching today's webinar. We've been recording it, so we'll have it up on the PCAP YouTube channel in the near future, so you can share it and get the word out there about how huge of a problem this is, and hopefully we can all do our part to help save bird lives. So with that, thank you so much, everyone, and have a great rest of your day. Bye now.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.